Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project. I'm just sitting down here to have a conversation with Alek, who's kindly taken the time to have a conversation with me about the Nations of Sanity project. Now, before we get into it, anyone who's watching this who has no idea what the Nations of Sanity project is, just to give you a very brief overview, the Nations of Sanity project is built on the assertion that the only way to create a truly free society with truly equal rights is to establish the non-aggression principle as the law through a universal peace agreement. And our assertion is basically that crime can and should be objectively defined by this universal principle rather than being decided arbitrarily by whatever ruling authority happens to be claiming rule over a geographic region. And for anyone who doesn't know what the non-aggression principle is, it's just the moral principle that comes from the concept of self-ownership, which is the idea that every individual has right and responsibility over only their own self. And I like to welcome everybody and anybody to come and scrutinize this idea and scrutinize this claim and this project in any way. And Alek has very kindly taken the time to have a conversation with me about it, and I'm sure that'll involve some scrutiny as well. So thank you, Alek, for taking the time.
Oh, you're very welcome, and maybe some people can go to the web link down below and check it out for themselves as well. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I'll put all links in below, and this will be on the channel as well. So
yeah, it's well worth a read. It really is.
I appreciate you saying that. So we'll kick off then, because we've not really spoken about it in much detail yet. So perhaps we'll just kick off with your initial thoughts and any questions, criticisms, anything you've got to say.
Well, let me start with some broad strokes. I really like the writing. It's intelligent. It's well thought out. It's well sectioned out. Yeah, I'm a communications teacher and a language teacher, so I did look at spelling and grammar. so force a habit, Yeah. I see a couple of holes here, though, especially in the NAP. And I wondered if you could answer some of these questions. Firstly, we've spoken privately about how not everyone's equal, how everyone's not the same.
Yeah.
And I kind of wondered how the system would deal with people who are, mentally disadvantaged, mentally disabled, and people who maybe, had a temporary break with sanity and did something. Maybe we can explore some of that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, basically, the way I would sort of deal with that, or I think should be dealt with, that is similar to how we would with children. I think it's a similar question because basically what we're saying is obviously that everybody has right and responsibility over their own selves. So we're saying obviously you own you, I don't own you, and I don't have a right to tell you what to do. You live your life and you rule yourself. But the obvious question comes, okay, well, what about people though that for whatever reason we don't give them that full freedom? And the obvious one is children, and I would say mentally handicapped people fall into the same category and for the same reason, because what we're going to say in their situation is they do have, obviously, they still have that self-ownership. They still have that right. But what we're saying is their ability to exercise that right is compromised by their inability to take responsibility for themselves. So you see, right, because the thing is with self-ownership is right and responsibility go hand in hand. So if, for example, you said to if let's say, for example, we had a situation where you said, okay, look, I'm unable to take, I've just taken a drug. Let's say I'll come up to you and I'll say, I've just taken a drug, and I'm just unable to take responsibility for my actions for the next 2 hours because I'm just
been there.
Yeah. Okay. Now you'll say to me, okay, well, in the next 2 hours, I'm not going to let you drive. And you've told me that I mean, obviously this is a very perfected situation, but just to get the point across, you've told me, you're going to be incapacitated. And what we're saying is it's not that you don't own yourself, but, and in this case, it's because you're going to be intoxicated, but for this 2 hour period, the real you is not at the wheel. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, well, in that situation, you don't have that same right to control your actions because you can't take responsibility for your actions. It's like it's like an involuntary action or something like that. And we're basically saying the same thing with children, because obviously we can understand, and again, the same would apply with mentally handicapped adults as well. Is what we're saying is okay, well, they're not fully developed beings who have the full understanding of the world around them, where they can take full responsibility of the self-ownership. So same thing with things like consent. They can't consent to things. They wouldn't be able to enter into a legal contract, obviously can't consent to sex, taking drugs, all of these sort of things. And obviously in the case of children, and this would also need to be the case with mentally handicapped adults, is in these situations you need to have a guardian. Now most of the time for a child, your guardian's going to be your parent, but it doesn't have to be, but that would obviously be the ideal situation. But in that situation, because a lot of things that's often said to me is, okay, well, does that mean you own your kids? And it's like, well, no, we've got to be clear. There's a difference between being a guardian and being an owner. Now, as the guardian, what you're doing is you're basically, the only ownership you have is over the duty of care that you owe. Now, for whatever reason, you're the guardian. Now, in the case of a parent, it's nice and obvious. You brought the child into the world, so you're responsible for them until they can take responsibility for themselves.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more.
And I think most people would agree that the logic follows. I mean, I always use the example of, look, if you're not necessarily obliged to save a drowning person, put yourself at risk and all the rest of it, but if you push them into the water, then you would be responsible.
You are definitely obliged,
Exactly. And I use the same kind of analogy for when it comes to children. It's like when you bring a child into the world, you're basically bringing them into an environment. It's like pushing someone into the water who can't swim. You're bringing them into an environment.
I say this all the time, Matt. I say you need a license to own a firearm. You need a license to drive a car, but you don't need a license to have a kid. I think there should be some kind of test. And I work with kids in special educational needs. That was my first role when I started teaching, and all of them had they gave me the ones with behavioural problems. They couldn't be responsible for themselves, and I found myself as their advocate a lot of the time, because they came from very, very bad backgrounds. So and I know some of them today, and some of them have gone on to be wonderful kids. They're wonderful adults. I mean, I've been teaching for about 20 years, and one of my kids, his name was Leon. I said, first day I met him, I had to take a knife off him. Third day I met him, I had to take a gun from him, and then I constantly had to remind him to remove his genitals from another student's genitals, pretty much constantly. Although I didn't say it quite so eloquently. And but he went off, and he turned into a real man. I mean, he joined the Marines like I did. He did 5 years. I did a little bit longer, and he came out of the Marines, and he's actually a police officer now, and he's a very good one. He's all about protect and serve. Now, whatever your opinions are about the police, some of them are good guys trying to do good things for the community. I mean, some of them get on a bit of a trip, and they go a bit over the top. But I've got to say, for the most part, the ones that I know, socially and historically, are pretty good guys.
Yeah, I mean, in the day, we're all human beings. Some of us more misguided than others.
True. We're not cookie cutter, man. Yeah, we're all individuals.
Exactly. I've certainly got a few things to say about the police, which we can talk about. But just to clarify with regards to how things would stand with regards to mentally ill people.
Oh yeah, please. Yeah, this is something I'm interested in.
But that's basically the situation. So what we're saying is, look, everyone does own themselves, and that's not changed by the fact that there are some people that, for whatever reason, can't take responsibility for themselves, whether they're children, whether they're mentally handicapped. But the fact of the matter is in those situations, we can't let them exercise the rule over their actions, if you like, that somebody who can take full responsibility over their actions, because like I say, right and responsibility goes in hand, and if you're capable of taking responsibility for your actions, then the only person who has right over them is you. But in a situation where you're not able to take responsibility for yourself, like I say, children, mentally handicapped, or somebody, like say, temporarily, like I might know you, and this is a good example, like use the drunk example. Like say you were blind drunk, and you were trying to get in a car to drive, and I basically stopped you until you were sober. Now when you're sober, I'm not allowed to stop you from driving, you know, like I'm not allowed to interfere with your life in that way. But when you were drunk, I was. And the reason why was because I can, and obviously I'm invoking a little bit of implicit consent. And this might be something that's also worth talking about, because one question that's often put to me is, okay, well, what about situations where you can't get consent? Now, I would say that children and mentally handicapped people is a situation where you can't get proper consent because they don't even understand.
Because they're unable to give consent. Yeah, it's quite
exactly. Right. But like there's other situations where you're unable to give consent, like someone who's in a coma, someone has an accident, or like there's a lot, or like say the drunk person who's not, you know, sober enough to give a of sound mind and body. You know, this is why, like when people enter into legal contracts, you can't be blind drunk when you enter it, because they know it's not really you, and you're not of enough what we would consider sound mind and body. To exercise your self-ownership. But there's still no question over who owns you. It's still always you. The only question that's being put in these situations is whether it's really you at the wheel. But the person who has the right to be steering is always you. You know what I mean? So that's never in question in those situations. And the reason why implicit consent comes into the situation is because there's going to be situations where you may have to act without being able to get explicit consent. Like say someone was about to get hit by a bus. Now they might want to get hit by a bus for all you know. But it's not
for some strange reason, that's unfathomable.
Exactly. But it's not very likely. So it's reasonable to assume that they would want you to push them out of the way of the oncoming bus and save their life. Now, normally, you wouldn't have a right to just push somebody. You know, if there wasn't an oncoming bus, that's assault. But because there's an oncoming bus, you're able to push them. And the reason why you're able to do it without their consent is because you're invoking implicit consent. It's reasonable to assume that they would consent to this, you know, retrospectively or whatever if they could.
That's incredible common sense, you know, the preservation of life, and I think that's a natural human instinct, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I think so. I mean, to be honest, I mean, one of the points I hope to illustrate in this conversation, and I always try to illustrate when I talk about the Nations of Sanity, is this is all really, at least what should be common sense. I'm not sure common is the right word for this, because it's perhaps sense. A bit rare.
Let's reframe that question. Good sense.
Yeah, that's probably a more appropriate. But yeah, I mean, because it all comes back, because I always say, like, when people ask questions about this, I mean, there's obviously not everything is necessarily clear at first glance. You might have to think about it a little bit, but the answer is always objectively identifiable, because it's not keep people coming to me and say, oh, well, how would you have it? And I'm thinking, oh, well, how would I like it to be? It's like, no. If everybody has right over only their own self, then these questions answer themselves. When we talk about what is and isn't a crime, those questions answer themselves, because whether or not I agree with what you're doing on some other subjective level, you know, I might still have a moral objection even to something that you're doing. But if it's not violating self-ownership, I have no grounds for saying it's a crime, because who's the victim? You know, like, for example, if I think you're say you're taking heroin recreationally, and I think, well, okay, I think you shouldn't be doing that.
That's a bad move.
Yeah, you know, and I think, okay, that's wrong. And maybe not just because I care about you, but maybe also just from I have some kind of moral objection where I don't think people should be allowed to, whether I care about them or not, just from you know, whatever. Regardless of my motivation, it doesn't matter.
It's not a blanket policy. It's not like, just because I believe this, everyone should do that.
Well, we're basically saying it doesn't matter what we believe. It's about saying, I mean, I suppose what I'm saying is this, and this is what I say about this being an objective way to define crime, is what I'm saying is if we accept self-ownership, if we accept that concept that everyone has right over only their own selves, then from there, every other question we ask about what is and isn't a crime is answered with that basic premise. You know what I mean? If I own myself, so then I ask the question, okay, so is it a crime for you to take heroin? The answer is, of course, no. It doesn't matter what I think about it. Doesn't matter if it's a good idea or not. That's a different conversation.
Right, yeah.
But whether or not it's a crime, it's not a crime, because if you're taking it, then
you're only harming yourself.
Exactly,
and that's the one. It's your body, it's your choice.
Exactly.
Yeah, there we go, man. Yeah,
nail on the head.
This is what I kind of really like about Nations of Sanity. But I've got a little specific question, and this is a bit of a segue here. At what point do we decide that someone can be responsible for themselves? Because at the moment we have like age of majority. Yeah. So in and age of consent. So in the UK, the age of majority is 18, and the age of consent is 16, right? So in your vision,
could you just outline the difference between age of majority and age of consent? Because I'm not 100% on it myself.
Okay. And there's also age of responsibility, which is 11. So age of responsibility is 11 years old. So you've done a crime and you're not considered stupid enough,
right?
Yeah, to know the difference between law and crime.
So that's criminal responsibility.
Criminal responsibility. Age of consent, which is 16, which is you can lawfully consent to having sex with someone else, and you know what the hell you're doing, apparently. Yeah, yeah. I saw the eyebrow raise.
I still don't.
and then the age of majority, which you're allowed to have a say in the laws and statutes of this country, and you're allowed to vote in the UK. Different nations around the world have different ages. For example, in China, the age of consent is 14.
Same in Germany as well.
Oh, really? Yeah. My goodness. And some countries don't even have it, which is really scary.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the first thing wrong with that is age of consent, age of responsibility should be the same thing. Because when you're old enough to consent to sex, that means you're old enough to take responsibility for yourself. And that also means you're old enough to be criminally responsible. And if you're not, then I mean, for me, it's not, and I will get into the fact that there's not an exact line that I can say, okay, it's this exact point, because it is a bit of a grey area. I will concede that it's a grey area.
Yeah, because it's different for everyone. We're not cookie cutter, right?
Exactly. But what I'm going to say, and there is an issue of grey areas, just generally speaking, that obviously is very highlighted in this particular subject.
Yeah, you've got a real melting pot here, my friend.
But I have a proposed solution for that, which we'll get into.
Okay.
But just to get onto the basic premise of age of consent, the idea that someone can be old enough to consent to one thing but not old enough to consent to another,
seems ridiculous.
Is absurd. So so for me, when we're deciding, so let's say because I'll tell you how I deal with the grey areas actually, and then I'll come back to this because it connects. So how we deal with the grey areas as a whole, which will also connect to this, is because this whole idea of making the non-aggression principle the law, the non-aggression principle is pretty black and white, it's pretty clear, but there's still grey areas, there's still kind of fuzzy edges, areas of differing interpretations, right? And I like to use the analogy, I don't know if you've come across the article yet, where the desert meets the grassland.
Yeah, that was really good.
I like that analogy because I like to say, okay, because this is representing what we're talking about. We've got a defined distinction, but we've also got a grey area in between. So like a desert and a grassland, we can say that a desert and a grassland are different and distinct from each other. But if you're walking from one to the other geographically, then there's going to be a fuzzy edge as one slowly becomes the other. It's a little bit of a continuum. There's not an exact point where, okay, this from here it's all desert and from here it's all grassland, and this exact line it separates the two. You don't have that. You have an area in between where it's a little bit of both, and it's a bit of a fuzzy edge, and you can't define it. And what we were saying is okay, well, in that situation, you still want to be able to keep the definition. You don't want to lose the black and white distinction just because there exists a grey area. So what you do is you just segregate the grey area from the black and white. So to just give you the example with the desert and grassland, in the desert and grassland situation, okay, well, the desert's definitely the desert and we can define that, right? And the grassland's definitely the grassland and we can define that. This area in between, we can't define. So we won't. we won't enforce it. So what we're going to say is, we're going to say, okay, well, the desert, when you're definitely in the desert, when there's only sand around you, no grass to be seen, it's not a grey area, you're definitely in the desert now. That's where we draw our line and say that's definitely the desert. And then the grey area is going to be like the grassland. And just to use it back to this whole idea of establishing the non-aggression principles, the law.
Nice analogy.
Is so if the desert represents what's definitely a crime, what's definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle, and then the grassland represents what's definitely not a violation of the non-aggression principle, therefore we're not enforcing nothing. We've got this grey area in between. What we're saying is the grey area is essentially the same as the grassland. We can't enforce it. We can only enforce past the black and white, right?
Got it.
And the reason why, and there's an important reason why as well, to keep the logical consistency of what I'm talking about, there's an important reason why that has to be the case. It has to be the case because when you definitely violate the non-aggression principle, I can use force against you. I am justified at using force against you. And we've already said that according to the non-aggression principle, it's the only time I'm allowed to use force against you is if you're violating the non-aggression principle. So if I'm on shaky ground as to whether you're actually violating the non-aggression principle, then I'm on shaky ground as to whether I'm committing a crime by using force against you.
Right.
You see what I mean about that's why the grey area isn't really something that we can enforce, because none of us have the authority to define the grey area ahead of anybody else. None of us can say, well, I think the line should be drawn here and you think it should be drawn there. None of us have anything other than arbitrary arguments as to why that's the case. Whereas when we're in the black and white, when we can say, okay, well, this is there's no way you can say this is not a violation of the non-aggression principle. It's nice and clear and it's black and white. Now, we can still have rules and standards and that in the grey area in a free society. But what we're going to say is in this hypothetical free society, that if the non-aggression principle was the law universally, is like these universal terms of peace, we can only enforce the black and white. But then what we do is, let's say, okay, well, I want higher standards than that. I don't want the age of consent being to the bare minimum or the bare maximum, that it could possibly be. I don't want to associate with people that go below this. I don't want to associate with people that do that. Even though it's not a violation of the non-aggression principle, even though it's not something I can use force against them, I might not want to be part of the same society, regulated market, whatever. So then you can still have voluntary collectives, whether it's like a regulated market, whether it's like a little club, whether it's like a whole society, it doesn't matter. These voluntary collectives can then have rules and regulations within those collectives that go beyond the non-aggression principle, but they don't violate it because they would only apply to people that are agreeing to them ahead of time. Like me saying, okay, well, I'm going to start up a little club where we all agree not to smoke cannabis. And in our little club, you're not allowed to smoke cannabis. But that rule only applies to you because you've agreed to be part of our little club. Everybody else can smoke cannabis if they want. Exactly. Yeah. And that's why but what we're saying is it doesn't matter if you're in our club or not. You're not allowed to rape, murder, rob, assault. Do you know what we're saying? This is
I understand what you mean, but where do we draw that kind of line? Because we spoke a little bit about advocacy for people who are incapable of doing something for themselves, either temporarily or permanently, and protection of minors, which is a very big thing for me. There's series of brain development. I had to read all of this shit, mate. I had to learn this shit when I trained to be a teacher. And you have these three parts of the mind. There's the id, the ego, and the superego. And the superego only starts developing at about the age of 13, and it's only fully developed by the age of about 21. Now, notice I use the word about. Okay.
Different for different people.
So not everyone's cookie cutter. I've had lovely young gentlemen and lovely young ladies in my classes who clearly have only just started that superego trip. Okay. And then I've had, in the same class, those that are well on the journey. Yeah. Because, I teach all the way up to pre-university and stuff like that. So we've got a lot of grey area there. We've got a lot of grey area there, Matt. And, where do we leave off with the advocacy for those particular individuals, and where do we start with our own personal responsibility?
Yeah, well, I mean, my approach has always been, like, when I always thought about it myself, was I always thought, well, you go to your obvious extremes and then you just bring it in until you get to a point where you are genuinely in the grey area. So, like, you know, like, we all know that a 3-year-old can't make its own decisions, and we all know that a 30-year-old can, and we all know that a 30-year-old can. Generally speaking, obviously, there's obviously exceptions. Not so much with the 3-year-old, but certainly with the 30-year-old. But what I'm saying is, you take a real obvious extreme just to kind of get the point. Like I say, we're right in the middle of the desert, we're right in the middle of the grassland, and then we just bring it in until all of a sudden, bringing it in from the desert, all of a sudden there's a bit of grass. Okay, now we're into grey area. Now we're into that territory that you're talking about, where it's like, okay, well, who makes that decision now? Because then this is the issue. But what I'm saying is you bring it in now. Up to a certain point, it's nice and objective. I mean, you certainly couldn't make the argument. I mean, this is also, and sorry, I don't want to be all over the place with my explanation here, but this also comes.
Okay. We can digress. It's good.
Yeah, well, this also comes back to how we define reality. You know, because there's a very important distinction between child and adult. Now, what are we doing? We're agreeing when one becomes the other, but we're not having a problem over agreeing that there's a distinction. So it's like the desert and grassland thing. The distinction's clear. We know that a child cannot, you know, take this responsibility, cannot consent, and that needs to have a guardian that's obviously doing that on their behalf until they become an adult, because that's how we define child and adult. A child is someone that's not yet a fully developed person, and an adult obviously is, and you know, so that's part of how we're defining reality. So that agreement is implicit. The only problem is there's this massive grey area, and it is a massive grey area, as to when a child becomes an adult.
I know. Maybe there should be a test.
well, let's put it this way.
Teacher in me speaking.
Well, I mean, let's put it this way: with when it comes to adults who are mentally handicapped, to a certain degree, there would be. I mean, you know, we cannot 100% down to the precisest detail escape subjectivity. We simply can't. But what we can do is we can minimize it as best we can. We can be as objective as it's humanly possible to be. And there's certain objective standards that we can come to a universal consensus on. Those being that we are all individuals, you know, because that's, you know, because some people will even disagree with that when it comes to the self-ownership thing. There'll be some people.
But don't worry, we've priorly agreed to this.
But what I'm saying is, it's depending on certain acceptances of reality, and that acceptance is that we're all individuals. We all have right and ownership over ourselves, but that that means responsibility and right that goes hand in hand, as I mentioned before. And so all we're really having a trouble with is saying, well, what do we do about the fuzzy edges? And what I'm saying is okay, as a matter of universe. So let's take age of consent. Let's get real specific. As a matter, and we're in our Nations of Sanity thing. It's happened. We've had the revolution.
All right. Yeah. Okay. I'm there.
Right. What's the situation with age of consent? Okay, well, this is the situation, right? There's 2 ages of consent. There's going to be one that's the universal one, like the limit, where we drew the line for the black and white, where we said, no, I don't care who you are. There is no possible argument within reason, obviously. You know, there's no reasonable argument. We've all, and like I say, there is a certain degree of consensus coming in here, but we've all agreed as a basic, you know, consensus on reality that you're definitely a child below this point, okay? And I would say that nobody could possibly make an argument below the age of 12, and I think they would struggle to get below the age of 14. But let's just say to, you know, hold the vomit in our mouths, let's just say the international standard was 12, okay? Right, let's just say that that's I think that's worst case scenario, but I'm happy to deal with worst case scenarios when it comes to picking the holes out.
Well, let's challenge it. Yeah, let's challenge it.
So that's the worst case scenario. That's the universal international standard. That means you cannot enforce let's say a rape law, for example, against let's say let's say there was some tribe in the Amazon. I know that some of them do marry very young and all of that. And are we going to step in there?
Know, even in the Middle East, you know, you've got 9-year-old kids being married to 30-year-old men.
Well, yeah, but I think that is a crime, though, and I think
you and me both, yeah.
But this is my point. But what I'm saying is that's not just down to my personal taste. That's down to the fact that there's no. What I'm saying is there's no objective argument for saying that a 9-year-old is not a child. There's just none. And there's no way I would accept a reality. Just like I say, we've got to accept the reality that we're all individuals and we all own ourselves. There's a certain limit. Like I say, there's a limit of tolerance to how far we're going to stretch differing interpretations. And me and you, reasonable people, could disagree over whether a 16 or a 17-year-old is a child. Reasonable people could disagree about that, but a reasonable person cannot disagree or agree or make the claim that a 9-year-old is a child. They just can't do it. And like I say, they couldn't possibly go below 12. I don't think. Like I say, I can't force it because what I'm saying is you're getting into they can't point to any physical characteristics. You're not even gone through puberty at that point. I know again, I know individuals go through it at different stages, but as a pretty universal standard, no one has gone through puberty by the age of 12. So
exactly. But then you've got. I had a boy in my in one of my classes. He was 16 and he still had like a little squeaky voice. Yeah, so, and, all the other lads were, nice deep baritones.
Well, yeah, and also I think people listening to this would, sorry, and I think people, go on.
Go on, Matt. Come on.
I was just going to say, I think people listening to this would probably make the obvious point that it's not about physical maturation as much as it is mental anyway, like obviously
correct.
They'd say.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Because obviously we're already talking about the fact that you could have physically mature adults who are mentally handicapped, who we're not allowing to take full control over themselves because they need a guardian to look after them for the same reason as the child. So it is more mental capacity. But I mean, again, like I say, I suppose what we're saying is, look, this isn't an exact science. But what we're also saying is just because there's a fuzzy edge, it doesn't mean we lose the distinction. Work. Well, and it doesn't mean that we lose this. Like with the desert grassland thing, we can't deny there's this massive area in between where we can't say for certain that this is desert. So we can't enforce it. We can't say, okay, well, you're definitely in the desert, because we can't say 100. We think you're pretty close.
You probably are, but yeah.
And sorry, and just to go back to the age of consent thing, this is where I come back to these collectives, because what I'm saying is, okay, as a matter of universal law, I wouldn't have the right to go around using force against people who were marrying at the age of 13, let's say, if they weren't part of my society and all the rest of it. But what I can do is absolutely refuse to be part of any society, regulated market, collective of any kind where I have any kind of dealings with or support for people like that. And that's where you set the high standards. That's where we're saying,
yeah. So this is what you coming back to what you were saying about like individualized groups who give their consent for something, right? Okay,
so this is what I'm saying about there being potentially two ages of consent, because you could come to me and say, hey Matt, okay, I've just woken up from a 30-year coma. I heard there was a revolution and the Nations of Sanity took over and established the non-aggression principles law. What's going on with age of consent? I'll say, okay, well, what happened is, unfortunately, some people that really wanted to be pedantic about being objective did bring the international standard down pretty low, and it is like 12. Okay, but all that means is we can't go into some tribe and start attacking some tribe who are marrying at the age of 13 because they're violating our rape laws. But what we can still do is we have another age of consent in this society that we're all a part of, and there might be people that aren't a part of our society, but they don't get to trade with us. We don't have nothing to do with them, etc., etc., and they're still not allowed to go below the universal standard. But we have a higher standard for all of us because we consider, for what we like I say, it's separating the subjective from the objective. So I can say objectively that if you had sex with someone below the age of 12, you're raping them. But I can say subjectively, I think you're a scummy person if you had sex with someone who's as young as 14. And I don't want to be a part of a society that supports you in any way. So this is what I'm saying. As a matter of using force, you have to be definitely violating the non-aggression principle. That's why we have to draw the line where it's black and white. And we can say, for sure, now you're stepping into that point where it's no longer grey area. It's no longer fuzzy edges. But in the grey area, we can still have standards, but they would only be enforced peacefully, if you like, which might sound a contradiction, but it's not really enforced. It's just kind of like, well, I suppose it is enforced in a certain sense.
You might sanction that particular community or that particular group who have agreed to that.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. I mean, the thing is like, one of the things about our society where we're all like forced to pay taxes and support things that we don't necessarily agree with is that's a choice that's obviously taken away from us, and this is the thing about being in a free society, is like saying, look, we need this universal standard for crime, and it needs to be objective because, and again, it comes back to that reality. If everybody has right over only their own self, if you own you and I own me and everyone's equal in that regard, then no one has a right to make law. The only way we can decide law is objectively based on that principle, because if you own you and I own me, then objectively it's a crime to rape, murder, rob, assault.
Of course.
It's as objectively true as 2 + 2 = 4. You know what I mean? It's not a matter of my taste or your taste. Whereas other activities that we might not like, well, we can still do things to discourage that in our society by refusing to associate it. We can have regulated markets that don't allow it within the regulated market. And this is another thing about like markets, for example. You can still have regulated markets in a free society, but you can also have unregulated markets that would no longer be criminalized. Like right now, we have the regulated market, and then we have the black market, and the black market is criminalized because you're not allowed to trade unregulated. In a free society, that wouldn't be the case. The black market, quote unquote, would just be the unregulated market. It would be no more criminal than the regulated market would be.
Because everyone's given their consent.
Exactly. I mean, unless it obviously involved actual crimes, because people say to me, okay, well, what about things like child trafficking and, slavery and all this?
I mean, I've seen the dirty end of the shitty end of the stick.
But the thing is those things are themselves crimes. And this is the important thing as well about dealing with crimes, is like a big motivation for me with, there's lots of things I think this connects to and lots of problems it solves. But one of the things it strikes at the root of is the corruption of our very notion of law, which is compromise law. Like the reason why criminals get away with so much is because the very notion of what law is has been completely twisted to the point that, apart from the fact that things like, a lot of things that are illegal then perversely actually help criminals, because you think about like the drug trade helping all the, and that only happens because the drugs are illegal, and if they weren't illegal, you wouldn't have the inflated price. Exactly. And all the rest of it.
It's Ouroboros, isn't it? It's like the serpent eating its tail.
Exactly. Yeah. And so one thing, they wouldn't have that. They wouldn't have these easy revenues from all these avenues that have been cut off to decent people who are obviously scared of skirting the law and all the rest of it. But the other situation you have is in a situation where only what I would call real crime is being fought, then you're focusing on that. We spend about 90% of our police budget policing the drug laws, and it's like, well, imagine what doesn't get spent on protecting people from rape, murder, theft and assault, real crime.
I know. This drives me crazy as well. You can go to prison for like 15 years or 25 years for a drugs offence, but you molest a child, you do 2 years. What is up with that? It drives me nuts.
Yeah, and the insanity of them is obviously the drug situation is not even a crime. Because again, we have to step back.
Because going back to what you're saying, you're only harming yourself.
Yeah, or again, another consenting adult.
The propagation of the fact that it's criminal, has that knock-on effect.
Exactly. So this is the thing, there's so many things, and one of the things that makes me a bit jumbled when I'm trying to present the Nations of Sanity is because there's so many things in my head about, well, it would solve this and it would fix that and it strikes at the root of this. And it does. I'd like to keep it simple because I said, look, it is all about one undeniable truth. And this is another thing that kind of frustrates me a little bit. And I'm not trying to get on like a high horse because I'm not saying I'm some super...
Listen, say it how it is and let everyone else interpret.
Well, there's something that frustrates me about this. The reason why I call it Nations of Sanity, apart from the fact that I like to emphasize that I'm not trying to create a utopia and I'm trying to create something that's very basic and foundational. But the other thing is, it's a little bit of a jibe. One person even criticized the name, said, it sounds a little bit like you're having a jibe saying that society's insane for not already being like this. And I'm like, well, I kind of am saying that because...
Well, opinions are like arseholes. Everyone's got one and everyone thinks theirs smells the sweetest. So don't get knocked back, Matt.
well, I don't, because one of the reasons why is because I fully confess to the accusation. Yeah, I do think our current society is obviously not fully, but that's what frustrates me. I'm not even close to the smartest person on the planet, and there's many very intelligent people in this country, on this planet that have lived, that do live. Why aren't more people making the very obvious point that if we all agree that we all have right over our own selves, which I think most people would if you actually approached them in the street and said, do you think you have right over yourselves? Do you think you should have right over somebody else, or, or whatever bullshit, It's like, okay, well, if we accept that, then, like I say, everything else is as simple as 2 + 2. If you own you,
I couldn't agree more.
Then crime is gone.
There's kind of like laziness that exists in people. Some people don't have your energy. They don't have my energy. They don't have Cedric's energy. Yeah, they exist in this state of tacit complicity. Yeah, where all they want to do is get up in the morning, drink their coffee, be a little drone, go to work, la 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 la. Yeah, come back, get their paycheck at the end of the month. Yeah, go to Marks and Spencer's, get their ready meal. Yeah, and go a couple of times a year, go to Spain. Yeah, I mean, it's this homogenous thing where people just accept things because they are simply content with their life, but they don't understand the more than they are. So, people are essentially selfish. People are essentially lazy. And I deal with this all the time. And it's a very sad state of affairs, Matt. It really is, because if more people were a lot more active, a lot more vocal, yeah, we'd push things a little bit more.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't disagree with any of that, but it's not even that group of people that I'm even talking about. I'm talking about the people that are more awake, that are more proactive, that do have the higher level of intrigue, intelligence, that I mean, it's a little bit like there's this march going on today, isn't there, in London, the world protests and all the rest of it. So there's plenty of people that are quote unquote woken up to what's going on, but they're not pushing anything like this idea. They're not saying anything like what this is. And like I say, so like I say, I'm not trying to say, I mean, look, there's more there. The whole idea of the non-aggression principle is not something I invented, and the idea of voluntarism and saying that this is how we should live as a society is something that better people than me promote to greater success. I mean, people like Larkin Rose are quite well known for promoting anarchism and stuff, but again, even Larkin, I've presented this idea to him, and he doesn't see it, and I find it, I struggle with it. I suppose I struggle to communicate this idea to people. I'm always grateful to people like yourself who will take the time to talk to me.
Thank you.
But I need help, because I'm trying to communicate this idea to other people. But I suppose the help I need, in addition to the feedback and the scrutiny, which has helped me develop and polish this idea, but also I need help understanding, like, why, like I said, like why it's not already the case, why people aren't already kind of and even when I present it to people, it's like I don't want to sort of like the people that are doing this march and this protest, it's like, oh yeah, that's great, and people say, well, this should fill you with hope, Matt, and I'm like, well, it does in the sense that it's nice to know that there's lots of people that want to stand up to the government and aren't going to take it and all the rest of it. But it's also a little bit disheartening, because even in that group of people, none of them have got a solution. They haven't got a solution between them. If you ask them, okay, what do you want instead then? What's your demands? Well, I want the government to stop oppressing me. Okay, well, that's going to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, like any time soon, man. Yeah, it's ridiculous, isn't it? This is something I teach my my grade 9s and my grade 10s. Do not come to me with a problem unless you've got a solution. Yeah. So I always teach them, if you've got a problem, figure out what you think the ideal solution is, and then come to me and say, this is my problem, so the reasons why, and this is what I propose. Yeah, and that's what I do in my psychology class. So I think that's a great idea. But if people can't figure out their own solution, and going back to, various levels of, awareness and responsibility, some people can't figure out their own solution. So you have to give them options. I mean, most people would rather take a multiple choice test rather than an exam that says, here's a question, now write an essay.
Yeah, sure.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah, so a lot of people don't have that capacity to, they're not able to, create, because, I've seen some severe, I've taught in 5 different national syllabi for various countries, curriculum for different countries, and I've seen that kind of education standard. And sorry, taking this back to what I know, I'm sorry about that, Matt.
That's right.
But I see, I see Chinese people who are just interested in memorizing stuff. That's all they want to do. They just want to memorize stuff. And, they sit in the classroom waiting for you to tell them the answers to the test so they can memorize it. And they're incredibly good at it. Yeah. And then, English kids, they're a little bit wild, they take some taming. Never needed a whip so far, or a cattle prod. But yeah, they tend to be a little bit more inquisitive. Yeah, so the learning works in a different direction. Thai kids, incredibly well behaved, very analytical, but they're all about how it sounds, and they're all about polite acceptance. Saudi Arabian kids, totally self-centric, self-serving, very, very arrogant. But once you understand that that's
the
how
culture they've been
up,
brought up in,
yeah, you kind of like get over the fact that it offends you.
Well, this is where it comes into the play, I think, also like the issue of tolerance and stuff like that, because people say, well, where do you draw the line with tolerance? And it's like, well, it's very simple. And it comes back to self-ownership. You don't have to tolerate anything with regards to what you're going to associate with, what you're going to support, and all the rest of it. But you do have to tolerate everybody else's exact same right to the exact same freedom and self-ownership that you have, which means, so when you say, oh, well, should I let this person do that? It's like, well, unless they're not, you don't have a right to stop them unless they're violating self-ownership.
They're violating someone else's safety or their own.
Yeah, and like I say, there's still plenty of other ways that you can, disassociate from them or deter them in the ways, in peaceful ways where you, basically try to, like, perhaps you want to shame them culturally, or perhaps you want to get society to shun them or something. If it's something that you feel that strongly about, you know what I mean? Like, like what I'm saying is there's room in this world. You talked about everybody being different. And this is something that I think the Nations of Sanity kind of solves more than anything. It is the fact that it allows for everybody to be different, because the only thing it doesn't allow is for us to interfere with each other's right to live our lives how we choose. You know what I mean? It's only saying, look, like the evangelical Christian who, let's say, hates gays, hates drug takers, thinks anyone who has sex before marriage is going to hell. That's fine. We can live in peace with those people. We really can, because they can refuse to be part of our regulated market. They can have their own little regulated market where everyone abides by these higher standards and what have you. But they don't have right to make war with people who don't want to be part of their little group and want to live lives a little bit differently to their ideals. But they do have the right to force people not to rape, not to murder, not to assault, not to rob, all things that are clearly crimes. And again, it's like about what also, I know you didn't ask this question yourself, but people often ask, who enforces it, who has the right to enforce these laws?
Exactly. That was one of my other points that I was going to make, actually, Matt.
Preempted you.
It's the watchdogs. Yeah, you preempted a whole bunch of stuff that I was going to talk about. But I think we should definitely talk about that, because that has been an age-old question about who regulates the regulators.
Well, this ties back to my feelings about the police as an organisation in their current state, and because when it comes to who enforces the non-aggression principle, it's like, well, it's quite simple when it comes to what the non-aggression principle is laying down. Everybody has the right to enforce it. We all have equal right to enforce this law, because all it is self-defense. It's not something that you can't have a particular group of people like a police that have special right to enforce it force laws that and do things that other people don't have a right to do. Everyone would have equal right. That doesn't mean everyone has equal ability. You know, the old lady isn't so well equipped to prevent herself from being mugged, you know, as
right.
maybe a strapping young man might, you know, and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is we all have the right to. Now, none of us have the obligation. No one's obligated to enforce the non-aggression principle. The only obligation that is on everybody is not to violate the non-aggression principle. So that's where we stand on a kind of, those are the terms of peace. We all have the right to do it. Now, what I would say is in a free society, the obvious sensible way is to still have dedicated organizations that enforce the non-aggression principle. Because as I say, the little old lady needs protecting. She can't defend herself. You know, there's a lot of people that, oh, I can protect myself and I don't need, that's fine. That's fine. They don't need, then that's fine. But there's plenty of people that do need, and there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with having a quote unquote police force that enforces the non-aggression principle. But what is wrong, and this is my problem with the police force right now, and this is what would be different in the society I'm talking about.
I'm listening.
These organizations cannot have and must not have any powers and any rights that every other individual doesn't have, because you and any other citizen, even in our current world, has a certain degree of power over citizens' arrest. Like if you saw someone being mugged, or if you saw someone being raped or attempted murder or whatever, and you stepped in, it's not advised, you know, but if you stepped in and you used force against that person, you're not going to get charged with assault, because it's understood that your force was justifiable use of force to enforce a valid law, to prevent a crime. Okay, so what we're saying is, because that's what the non-aggression principle is really saying, it's saying this is the standard when force is justified, and that's why it makes a perfect principle for law, because it's the only, you know, that's what law is. Law is something that we're forcing. It's a rule that's forced on people. So, and the only thing that you can justifiably force on people is the non-aggression principle. That's why I say it's a no-brainer. That, but what I'm saying is, in that situation, because the police don't need extra powers and rights to enforce proper laws, like real laws.
I completely agree with you.
Because enforcing, like, this is the beauty of the non-aggression principle. Enforcing the non-aggression principle is, by definition, an act of defense. Not necessarily defending yourself. You might be defending somebody else, but it's still defense.
Correct,
And the non-aggression principle doesn't prohibit all force. It prohibits the initiation of force against peaceful people. But enforcing the law, if the non-aggression principle was a law, wouldn't involve initiating force against peaceful people, because by definition, you're only using force against people that are themselves initiating force, which makes it defensive by definition. And in this situation, because in the current situation, the reason why police need these extra powers, partly is because a lot of the laws they enforce, like police wouldn't be able to enforce drug laws, for example, if they didn't have the right to initiate force against peaceful people, because that's exactly what they're doing. And this comes back to it, you know, because like my objection to drug laws isn't just the harm that they do and the counter, and how they're counterproductive, and how they actually increase the harm of drugs and increase the money for criminals, and all the things that they're pretending to fight, they actually make worse. It's not even because of any of that. The reason why I hate drug laws is simply because drug laws are themselves a crime. And that's what makes it such an absurd perversion and corruption, is that you're enforcing a law that is itself a crime, because enforcing drug laws involve initiating force against peaceful people. Now, that is a crime by any other standard. If I went up to you and punched you because you were smoking a joint, I'm guilty of assault, and I can't say, well, he was smoking a joint. It's like, well, so what? It was, you know,
That's right. You know, I want to play devil's advocate on this one, Matt, if I may. And you know, I love to do this. I'm sorry, man. Don't hate me, right? So, how do we stand in a situation where someone is below an agreed age of consent, or mental responsibility, and they might be taking drugs? So where do we go with that?
Okay, well, they can't consent to that, just like they can't consent to sex and things like that. So in a situation of drug taking, it would be the responsibility of the guardian to approve that. Now, in the situation of a drug that was actually for their benefit, because this is the other thing, it's like, okay, well, does that mean that the guardian could consent to their child to have sex, you know, if they've got the power over them? It's like, no, because the guardian is not the owner. They don't have the same, like say I'm your parent. You're a child, I'm your parent, right?
I'm feeling younger already.
I'm not your owner, okay? So I don't have the right of control over you that you will have when you're an adult, or even the control over you that you have now as a child.
It's kind of like advocacy or advisory.
It's I mean it's guardianship. I do think that is the best word for it. It's like, you know, if I said, look, I don't own this property, I'm just guarding it, that I have a duty of care. I swore an oath to guard this property. You know, it's kind of like that. It's a guard. You have and like I say, in the case of a parent, your duty of care is owed because you brought the child into the world, now you owe that child safe passage to it at least being a consenting adult. Once they're a consenting adult, then you don't have to look after them anymore, and you can wash your hands of them if you wanted to. Not that many people would, but you know what I'm saying.
As many parents go,
exactly. But the point is what we're saying is before that time, if you just like what I'm saying is if you were my son and you were in your 30s and you're a sound mind and body, and I let you, live on the streets or, starve or whatever, as reprehensible as I might be as a parent and, all the rest of it. Again, this is the difference between the subjective morality and the subjective
you're making a very extreme point, but I can see why you're doing it.
I haven't committed a crime because I'm not responsible for you anymore. You're your own person and you're fully responsible for yourself. But when you were, say, 8 or 9 and you were still a child, I was still responsible for you because I hadn't, like, to use the analogy, what I said about pushing you in the water, I haven't pulled you out of the water yet, or I haven't taught you to swim at least. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that. So you're still unable to swim and you're still trapped in the water. I've got to keep you afloat. It's the same analogy with the parent guardian thing. And it's the same thing with with things like drug taking and all the rest of it. The reason why I couldn't consent on your behalf for you to have sex as a child is because the only reason I can consent on your behalf is because I'm invoking that implicit consent that I talked about. That's why I wanted to bring that up, because it is important to these things. Because the reason why I have to invoke implicit consent is because I have to work on the basis that this is for you as you in the role of your guardian. I'm not acting as in the role of you. So like I own myself fully, so I can do what I want to myself, but my duty of care over my son is much different. I can't do what I want to him because I've got to act as his guardian with his implicit consent. So what I'm saying is when he becomes old enough and aware to make full consent, he would retrospectively, or at least it's we can't be exact mind readers over what our children want and how they want us to raise us.
Yeah, for sure,
But again, this is the grey area. This is why we say we don't enforce the grey area. It's like a bit like child abuse and that. You say, okay, well, how do you feel about spanking, for example? Like a lot of people are very opposed to spanking, and there's a bit of a broad definition on spanking. But again, it's okay, well, this is why we've got to draw an important line, because there's a grey area over how a good way to discipline your child. But then you get there's a point where you go past that grey area where you cross the black and white line into child abuse, where there's no possible argument where you can say what you're doing is for the benefit of the child. And just to give you a quick example, and I don't personally smack my child, and I don't think it's a good way to parent, but I wouldn't.
I'm in complete agreement with you.
But what I wouldn't say is that everybody who's ever smacked their child has committed a crime. I don't think it's a non-aggression principle violation necessarily, even though I don't think it's necessarily the best way to parent. Because let's say, for example, if it was truly for discipline, you're saying, okay, well, this is how I'm communicating my child. I'm doing it for their benefit.
This is the action. This is the consequence.
Yeah, and it's a little bit subjective over, like some people say, oh, the reason why he's a little shit is because he wasn't smacked enough. And then some other person who perhaps was a bit more of a psychologist might say, well, actually, no, it's perhaps because he was smacked too much, or mistreated in some other kind of way or whatever. And I do fall into the category.
Well, as you know, I've dealt with traumatized kids. So,
you probably
I completely understand.
You probably have a few strong opinions on this, but my point is this is where we would say, okay, well, we would have strong opinions on that, but it would still be in the grey area when it comes to, okay, well, I don't think that's the best way to parent, and I think this would be better and all the rest of it. But at this point, let's say you just, if you're a parent who just gets drunk and just beats his child, or you hit him because you're angry or something like that.
Yeah, that shit happens all the time. It's more common than you think.
Unfortunately, it is. And to be honest, without, I'm not going to say that, even parents that are perhaps otherwise good parents may have even, we're all human beings, may have even done sort of like, perhaps snapped in anger rather than purely just in that discipline kind of.
Listen, focus. Nobody's perfect all the time.
Exactly. But my point is if you hit your child because you're angry or you're drunk or whatever, then that's child abuse. Then you've committed a crime. And then that sort of behavior would certainly give grounds for someone to take their kid away from you. But if you smack your child as a manner of discipline, even though I personally don't think that's a good thing to do for various reasons. I personally wouldn't exercise it for my own parenting. And maybe if I felt really strongly, I wouldn't want to associate with people, although I don't feel that strong, but if I, maybe I would. I know people that do feel that strongly. Like, I think it's disgusting and I wouldn't want to even be friends with people. Like, yeah, again, this is where we can have those higher standards still. But when we're bringing it down to base level of what is a crime, keeping that universal standard that's nice and objective, then we can say, okay, well, we can agree to disagree over using, like, you know, what we would class as spanking for discipline. But when it comes to when we say it's stepping over that line of child abuse, and again, unfortunately, and this is one problem I will say, look, this, I can't solve this fully because it's just not a solvable problem, is everything's going to have some kind of fuzzy edge, some kind of gray area. There's always going to be, and that's why we're going to have to take it to its most black and white, draw a line, say that's the universal standard, and if people want to make better standards than that are more specific, then get your little voluntary
then they're welcome
collectives.
to go and do that.
Exactly. I hope that all makes sense. I'm a bit all over the place with
no, that's all right. It's been really interesting to kind of explore this with you. It's been a lot of fun. Coming back to I've got a couple of things that I'd like you to be aware of, if you'd listen. So you know, there's like a sort of like generation gap, and even though I'm really old, I know older people than myself. So and you know, I've lived in lots of different countries and lots of different cultures. You know, I've got a house in Thailand and I live there most of the time. A house in China, I live there most of the time when I'm working. And grandmother lives in the house with us. Now, Thai families are incredibly complicated. So they have this kind of hierarchy. So most of the time when my wife and I are living in the house, my wife has to look after all the children. And then the next youngest member of the family, and she's a cousin, she has to walk up every day from her house, it's about maybe half a mile, and do all the cleaning. And then the next youngest one, who lives the other direction about the same distance, has to walk up and do all the cooking. Okay. Now, grandmother just sits there, and any of the kids get out of line, she's got a catapult. She shoots the kids with the catapult if they get out of line. But their definition of out of line is very much different. It's you know, the kids can make a bit of a mess, they can play together, they can run around, but you know, if they are putting themselves in potential danger, that's when the catapult comes out. So grandma's got the right idea, but you know, her idea of disciplining the kids is very vastly different from me. All the kids run and jump on my hammock and hide behind me when they think they've done something wrong, and I usually get the stone from the catapult. So you know, culturally across the board, what you're saying about, you know, NAP is it works, but and I like what you've broadened with the interpretation and stuff like that. It really works well. As you know, I used to be in the military, and now we're going to delve into sort of like people not knowing what they're getting into. So I was asked to, well, we were missioned with protecting people in Sarajevo in Eastern Europe, and every morning there was people would want to go to the supermarket. Now the supermarket happened to cross on a very broad street, and at the end of this broad street, like way up there, was a high-rise building which was controlled by one of the militias, and they'd stationed snipers up there. So we'd have to stop all the people, and they were all hungry. They wanted to get to the supermarket. Their babies wanted food, la 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 la, and they were all shouting at us, you know. And you know, we had to give a show of force. Sometimes we had to get a little bit physical with them, pushing them back. And then, you know, when we had enough people, we'd have the APC, armored personnel carrier, drive slowly out with all the people stood behind it. Otherwise, people would get hit by sniper fire. And so, you know, we'd walk them across, and, you know, they'd get to the supermarket, and then we'd walk them back. You know, one morning, a lady came out. She had a kid with a pushchair, and she must have just slipped through, and she caught a round straight through her hips. Yeah, the kid in the pushchair got knocked to one side. Me and my pal ran out to rescue her. We got the kid back. We pulled her back. Heavy fire. But, you know, did I do right or did I do wrong? Did I let her just go out there and do her own thing, or was I using my knowledge about the situation, to prevent people from getting harmed?
Yeah, I mean, it gets complicated in like war-torn situations because obviously because obviously you're under a lot of duress, and when you're in a situation of immediate threat, then, you know, like, you know, I mean, it's like, for example, if you've got like, you know, in like states of war and that, for example, and you've got like armies coming in and all the rest of it, and you think, okay, well, we want to stop people to make sure that they're not, you know,
in danger,
or endangering us, you know, they're not coming in with guns or whatever else and all the rest of it and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, well, technically you can say, yes, we all have right over our own selves. So technically you don't have the right to tell this woman she can't walk out in front of that gunfire if that's what she wanted to do. Technically. But then again, you probably are also invoking a little bit of implicit consent to say that she probably does want you to keep her safe. And perhaps you would need her to explicitly kind of indicate otherwise that you really were violating her consent before you could really tell yourself that you were. I mean, let's put it this way, I just to give you a similar example and kind of help illustrate where we stand on it, is someone put to me to the point about going back to the example of pushing someone out of the way of an oncoming bus, and then you later found out that they wanted to do it. So you don't have their permission. And let's say it's not a bus, because then you can still say, well, you can still push them out of the way because it's not fair on the bus driver, and, you know, they don't have a right. So let's they were in
the way of a bullet that was flying through the air.
Or let's just say they're going to jump off a bridge. So they're not harming anyone else. So again, they're exercising their right. Okay. Technically, if they're of sound mind and body and they want to end their life, as bleak and horrible as that is, technically they have that right. And technically, if you stop them, you would be guilty of a crime. If I took my friend and I kidnapped him and I tried to make him see reason and all the rest of it, he might not press charges if I was successful in whatever. But technically, yes, I am committing a crime. And maybe I love him that much that I would be prepared to commit a crime
the consequences,
to do that. But on a technical level, when you say, okay, well, and it's a little bit similar with this situation, it's like, okay, if you truly are, and like I say, if you want to make it black and white, because we're talking about things having to be black and white, if you want to make it black and white, say, are you explicitly violating her self-ownership by violating her consent, by not letting her go here or go there? And like I say, and this is working on the basis that she's only harming herself. Obviously, if her going here or there is potentially endangering you or somebody else, then you obviously do have the right to step in, because it's not, she doesn't have the right to harm others and blah, blah, blah. But if she's only, if she's in a situation where she's only harming herself, and then she can say, okay, well, I'm exercising my self-ownership, and you prevent her, then yes, you would be in violation, and technically she would have the right. You should let's go back to the Nations of Sanity, because there's no guarantee there'd be no war. We're in the Nations of Sanity situation. You're the soldier and I'm your guy, and you just want to check with me how we stand on international law. Okay, well, hang on a minute. She just wants to walk out there, and she's going to get killed if I let her. What can I do? And he'll just say, look, have you explained, made it explicit? Is she explicitly telling you she understands, and she just says, look, I want to go. Okay, you got a letter. And if someone's that determined to kill themselves, we don't have a legal right to stop them based on this idea that everyone has right over themselves. And
that kind of works against my nature, though. That really works against my basic instinct, because me and my pal, we saw it happen, and we ran out there full pelt. Yeah.
But is it not fair to say, though, that in that situation, because obviously I simplified it to a situation, to a bit different to the example you gave to make it more explicit that you're definitely violating her self-ownership. But the situation you described wasn't quite so clear that you were violating her self-ownership, because are you 100% sure that there's no implicit consent from her there, that she didn't want you to rescue her? Because it seems to me that she would.
No, she was very grateful. I still get Christmas cards from her and her kid.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, this is why the distinction needs to be made, because you can still act with implicit consent and do things like that. I changed the example to talk about when you would actually be violating her self-ownership, just to clarify that. But
we've ventured between desert and grassland again, haven't we? It's really good. How do you know in that moment?
Well, you don't, but this is why you would be perfectly justified. You don't, just like I don't know in that moment when I push the guy out of the way of the oncoming bus that he's not suicidal. I don't know that, but it's reasonable for me to invoke implicit consent. And 9 times out of 10, I'll be proved right retrospectively. He'll say, thank you. I didn't see it coming. Just like the lady was immensely grateful to you. So what I'm saying is not only would I say that in your situation, it's not grey area for me even. It's implicit consent. And not only is it, but what I'm saying is, even if it was grey area, we're still saying, well, I can't say you violated the non-aggression principle because it's grey area. You see, and also one other thing that's important about that grey area is it also embodies the spirit of innocent until proven guilty. Because what we're saying is if we can't say for certain that you're committing a crime, then we're not allowed to use force against you, because if we do, we're committing the crime. And that's the reason why we have innocent until proven guilty today, because we're saying, well, look, if we start treating people as if they're guilty when we haven't proven it, then we're going to be guilty of doing a lot of nasty shit to people. You know what I mean? So
yeah, right.
And this is my point about, and sorry, this comes back to the police thing as well, and why I have the opinion I do of them, is unfortunately, because so much of what the police do is, objectively speaking, a crime, that makes them a criminal organization. And unfortunately, that does make every member a kind of criminal as a result.
Kind of gangster, man. Yeah, no, exactly. I completely agree. A lot of people that I know, they're all ex-military. They've enrolled in the police force, and they feel like, hold on, I'm stuck with this regulation and this regulation, and they're nice guys. They're really nice guys. I mean, I served with them, and they just want to help people. They just want to protect people, like 99% of them. I mean, there are a couple of arseholes, admittedly, right? But 99% of them, they just want to, protect people from themselves and from other people. And, they have a really hard time with it.
Yeah, and, I understand
that piled on top of, all the shit that, we've all been through. Yeah, it's hard to deal with. We're probably going to completely differ on this, but I do believe that the, people who are on the ground, boots on the ground, the police, they deserve our sympathy and our understanding a lot of the time. Yeah, there are some complete fucking arseholes. I'll grant you. Yeah, I'll grant you. I've met them. Yeah, so, but a lot of them just want to protect people, and there's not a lot of options when you come out of the military in terms of employment, and most of them go into the police force. Yeah.
I understand what you're saying, and look, I mean, I will say this because I do have a very anti-police sentiment.
Yeah, I feel you.
As you could probably guess.
Well, I would have been a policeman, except for the fact that I'm pretty good at teaching.
Well, so, I mean, I tell you what, I mean, the thing is, though, with my own anti-police sentiment, I mean, it is largely for the reasons I mentioned, because the police have unfortunately become a criminal organisation.
But it's like that kind of like face to it, though, isn't it? Like, you're given a word and a visible uniform to hate. Yeah, I mean, it's like when we were in Somalia. Yeah, blue hood on your helmet, everyone hates you. Yeah, just because you got a blue hood on your helmet. Yeah, when we were in Liberia, same deal. Yeah, Bosnia, same deal. Kosovo, same deal. They didn't look at you as an individual. They just looked at you as this collective unit. But and it was regardless of what kind of person you were inside. Yeah. So, I would caution people not to label so much. What I would do is say, trust and look at the individual beyond the uniform. I mean, he's wearing the uniform for authority, which I don't really agree with, because it distinguishes one level of authority from another. But at the same time, you know, some poor sods have got to do a job.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, there's a slight difference with, for example, the examples you give about how people would. I mean, because you've got to remember, you're an occupying force, so you're probably going to expect people to look at you that way. Now,
Oh, God,
I think
yeah.
I would ask people who are police officers to really think hard about why their own citizens look at them that way. Treat them like an invading, or think of them like an invading army. And I would argue that a big reason for that is because that is how they act as an organization, like an invading, like an occupying force that is there to enforce laws against us, not protect us, you know, to, you know, as a danger to us. I mean, it's like, without being disparaging, I mean, like I say, I do, you know, passions and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I know, no problem.
But fully accepting the fact that we're all human beings, and there's many that go into the police force with good intentions and that are good-hearted people, and all that. I will fully accept that. I might quibble over the percentages,
sure thing, man.
with regards to good cop v bad cop.
Yeah, no problem. I can completely get down with that. It's all right.
But one of my reasons why I've always kind of taken the stance that there's no such thing as a good cop kind of attitude, it's not so much a personal attack on them as people, although there is a little tinge of that, I'll grant you.
Okay.
But what it mostly but what it mostly is the simple fact that, as I said before, objectively speaking, they are criminals. However misguided and however they don't want to be, and that's not in their heart to be, and they might not like a lot of the laws they enforce and all the rest of it, that doesn't change the fact that that's exactly what they are part of. And in many cases, you know, like what I'm saying is even the quote, like the what we call the good cops and the bad cops, when we're talking about that, we're talking about, when we talk about bad cops, we're talking about ones that step outside of what they're supposed to do and abuse their authority, you know, commit crimes, even according to the current laws, you know, break the rules even they're supposed to abide by, all of that sort of stuff. And then one of the big arguments against the existence of good cops is like, well, there wouldn't be so many of these bad cops if the good cops were doing their jobs a little bit better. So hence there's a disbelief that the good cops exist.
So they're made complicit into that umbrella of everything being bad.
But also, I would say, even if you completely took that to one side and ignored that, just completely took that to one side, and let's just say, okay, let's pretend there are no quote unquote bad cops. They're all just what we call the good cops. They're just following orders. They're still criminals. Every time they enforce a drug law, every time they bust into some cancer patient's house and steal his cannabis that he's using to try and keep himself alive, not only are they criminals, but they are criminals on the level of evil equal to Nazi soldiers, Soviet soldiers. You know what I'm saying? So all of a sudden,
I feel you.
And this is why, and the thing is, and this also drives the Nations of Sanity thing, because I understand what you're saying about some of the people that go into the police force with good intentions and wanting to be what the idealist might think of the police to be. My point is this is the way we could actually have that happen, because the reason why the police force are hated is because of a lot of the reasons I've laid out. But imagine a world where they only enforce the non-aggression principle, where they don't have these extra powers to abuse, they don't have extra laws to stamp onto people, they don't serve anything other, that they don't have any, you know, they could just, they're literally there to serve us. Because nobody hates the fire brigade, nobody hates the paramedics and the other emergency services. Why do we hate the police? Because they're not there to help us. 9 times out of 10, they're the ones that are a danger to us. So what I'm saying is in this situation, I have a lot of hatred, which isn't healthy, but I'll cop to it. I'll confess to it.
All right, no problem.
I have a lot of hatred.
There are margins of society which I feel the same about.
I feel that way about the police. I struggle to think of a group, if you, and I, like I say, I'm still accepting that people are individuals, and when I see a human being, I still see a human being. I don't want to dehumanize people in that way. But when I'm talking about contemptible groups, police are right up there. They're right up there with some of the lowest of the low, in my opinion, because of what they do as an organization. And and although there are well-meaning people, I do have to say that you have to be pretty willfully blind to not understand what the reality is. I mean, let's put it this way. There was a time in my life, and it's very, very, very young in my life, like 4 or something like that, when I wanted to be a police officer. When I very first got introduced to the concept of somebody that was going to protect people from criminals, that sounded like a noble profession. And it didn't take me too long before I started realizing the realities.
A little bit fucked up, right?
And not, and this is my problem with the police. It's, you know, I've got, like, people think, oh, I'm just like, you know, it's not like an anti-police thing as a broad thing. Like, if the police were what they're supposed to be, I probably would have been one myself. You know, like you said, oh, you want to be one. I would have, but the last thing I'd want to be is a police officer, because it's, for me, they're almost the antithesis of what they're supposed to be. For me, when I see the police, I wish there was an actual bigger police that could arrest these criminals. Do you see what I mean?
This runs round to our question, which is, you know, who watches the watchdogs? I mean, you know, when I joined the Marines, I thought it was a very peaceful time. Actually, it was like, you know, end of the Cold War, and I thought I'd be handing out food parcels in Africa and keeping doctors safe. You know, that's what I thought I'd be doing. But then the world went to shit in a fucking tin can, and I got deployed all around the world. Yeah, unfortunately. And, you know, I had to do some pretty despicable things, which I'm absolutely not proud of. You know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that. But, you know, that goes to show that, you know, there are good people, yeah, in positions of authority that, you know, want to make a difference, and they're forced by circumstance, yeah, to do the most horrendous kind of stuff. Yeah.
And that's why I want to change. I
have to sleep on when I sleep with my wife in the bed at night, I've got Velcro cuffs, and I sleep on my front with my hands cuffed, because, you know, I woke up one night and my hands were around her neck. Yeah. And, you know, she's the person in the world that I want to preserve above all. You know, I'd walk in front of traffic for her, you know. I love her so deeply.
Yeah, you make. I'm to be honest. You make. Sorry, go on.
Unfortunately, because of what I have experienced and what I've been forced to do, it has had a significant effect on me. I'm not crazy. Yeah, when I'm fully aware and conscious, yeah, I'm not a crazy guy. Well, at least I think so. Right, but. You know, there are a lot of people in this position as well.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, you make a good point, and I think it is. I'm glad you've emphasised it, because it is important. It is important to not forget the human beings behind all of this, and the fact that we are, in many cases, forced into it, which is, again, comes back to me wanting to create a world where you're not going to be. But this also comes back, because this comes back to the idea of, it's not about vilifying the individuals. It's about fixing the situation, you know. Yeah, it's about.
I'm 100% behind you there.
You know, I mean, I'm less. I mean, that's the thing. I don't want to live in a world where I'm just hating the police for being criminals. I want to live in a world where the police are what an idealized child might think they are. Right. You know what I mean? There to protect us, the same way the fire brigade put out our fires. You know, I mean, because that's the thing. When you're a kid, you're teaching your kid what they're all supposed to do. It's like, oh, well, the fire brigade, they put out our fires, and these are the ambulance people. They come and get us when they're sick and take us to hospital. And the police, oh, they beat the shit out of us if we smoke weed. It's like, you know what I mean? It's like, you're not painting a picture of a hero there, are you?
No, you're not.
But all of a sudden, but most people obviously don't teach their children that. But when they're teaching their children, they say, well, these are the people that protect us from the bad guys. And it's like, I'd like that to be as true, because it is true with the fire brigade, that what we teach our children, what the fire brigade are, is what they are. They're the people that put out fires. And what we teach them, the ambulance services, is what they are. They're the people that come and get us when they're sick. But what we teach the police about what they are is the opposite of what they are. We tell them they're there to protect us from the criminals. And the truth of the matter is, the reality for many, many people, including myself, the biggest danger to us and the biggest committers of crimes against us have been the police.
Yeah, you know, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you know, they really need to do some fixing in terms of their social image, and I think their selection process should be much more rigorous. And I think there should be, and going right back to the beginning of our conversation, where I said, you know, you need a license to drive a car, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, I think you should have some rigorous testing before you're enrolled into any law enforcement organization. Yeah, both psychological and mental. Yeah, because you know, you have like three kinds of people in the military. I can speak from experience. Excuse me. You have the guys that are absolute blue blood patriots. You know, they got a hard on for, you know, getting out there and being for their nation. Okay, that's great. All right, that's fine. All right. You want to do whatever you're told? Okay, be a little drone. Off you go. Yeah, and then you've got the guys who are fascinated with being survivors. Yeah, so, you know, they're preparing for the fucking zombie apocalypse or something like that, you know. And then you've got the third kind of person, and this is the most dangerous kind. And they're there because they want to have an excuse to kill people. And I've seen this, and these are not cool people. And some of these people filter back into our society. And unfortunately to say, some of them filter back as police officers, because, as I said, a lot of the ex-military go into the police.
But the problem is it attracts those sort of people precisely because, I mean, if you were a narcissistic, nasty person who wanted to exert authority over people, who wanted a position where you could just basically, you know,
tell everyone what to do,
then you're going to be a copper, you know what I mean? And the problem is, and this is why I say that if we had a society where the police still had the duties of protection but didn't have the powers, because they don't need them to enforce proper laws, they don't need them,
right?
So if they didn't have those powers, you know, like I mean, I know it's not so much of a thing over here, but like, you know, the whole thing about qualified immunity that they have in America and stuff, you know, things like that should be non-starters. But the very idea that an officer can put their hands on you but you can't put your hands on them, no one should be allowed to put their hands on anybody unless someone's violating the non-aggression principle. And then the right to put their hands on you that the police officer's exercising is no different the right that any other person would have. The difference is the police officer ideally would be trained and that dedicated to doing that job, whereas passerbys may not be so well equipped, but they would have the same right. Just as you and me would have the right to tackle a robber or a mugger or a rapist or anybody we saw actually committing a crime, and we'd have the right to detain them, and we'd have the right to hold on to them, and we'd have the right to exert some kind of punishment and all the rest of it. Don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that we live some kind of vigilante societies where everybody...
No, I get you.
But what I'm saying is the fact that we have that right doesn't mean that that's how we're going to live. We're still going to want our dedicated organizations. You know, I have the right to pull my own teeth out, but if I got a tooth infection, I'm going to the dentist, you know. And I have the right, if I should have the right, if I wanted to, I should have the right to patrol the streets and just see if everybody's safe. And I do have that right now.
If you want to wear the Batman outfit, that's absolutely fine.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's a little bit like when someone did argue, because I mean, a lot of people do have a bit of a visceral reaction to the idea of everyone having the right to enforce the law, because they
we actually do. We have citizens' arrest in the UK, right?
Exactly. And I point out that the reason why the police have these other powers is because they need them to enforce all of these immoral laws that shouldn't even be laws, where they need to be able to initiate force against people and do things like that.
Yeah, you know, Matt, I think it's a little bit fucked up because, you know, we've got two systems of law in this country. We've got acts of statute, which are passed by Parliament, as you know, and then we have acts of tort, which are passed by judges. And both are enforceable at different degrees. And then we have like silly shit like bylaws and stuff like that. But it's just like everything is like compounded on top of each other because acts of statute can't be revoked. And it seems, you know, ridiculous to me. I mean, it's like, you know, you have to put another act of statute in place in order to countermand a previous statute. Why not just take the other statute off the book?
Well, I mean,
Yeah, crazy, right?
well, this is the problem, and this is why law is such a mess. And like I said, I've got no problem with collectives having, little rules within their collectives that apply to them and all the rest of it. But they don't have a right to enforce their bullshit on other people. Like I say,
Oh, hell
that's
yeah.
why, and that's why I say it seems simplistic, but it really does work, and it does strike at the heart of all of these problems that we've gone through. That if we just had this law, because the thing is as well, it's like, well. It's like, because sometimes people say to me, well, who are you to say that these things should be law? And that's my whole point. It's not about me saying it. A computer could be telling you this. Like, a computer could be saying, like, if, like 2 + 2 = 4, nice maths equation. If, and like I said, it does depend on that if of self-ownership, but I tell you what, you have a struggle making any kind of moral argument if you reject self-ownership. So it's a hard one for people to reject, but there are people. But the thing is, the people that reject self-ownership are people that are like, the people that are proponents for fascism or slavery or they're Satanists or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like, what I'm saying is 19, because this is the problem. This is the thing that frustrates me, I suppose, is this does actually strike. I think if this ever got like mainstream traction, like if this was ever part of a mainstream conversation, perhaps promoted by more competent communicators than me, I think it would become unstoppable because it strikes at the heart of what we all know to be true. It's a moral truth that we couldn't deny if we wanted to. And I challenge people with this, and anyone listening, the challenge is open to people. I have certain assertions with the Nations of Sanity that I say are like, that like I say, there is objectively true as 2 + 2 = 4. And the
but you're very flexible, Matt. You listen to people. You read the comments. You apply what you believe intelligently in your replies. I think it's fantastic. So I would also invite people to have a little chat with you. It's really good.
I appreciate you saying that, man. And the thing is the reason why I'm like that is because, from my point of view, I mean, one of the reasons is because I feel like the best way for people to understand this is to scrutinize it and say, well, what about this? And what about this? And the more those questions get answered, they get a better picture of what I'm talking about and understand it. And then I think, because that's the real kind of cross. And from my point of view, I'm saying, look, this is undeniable. I feel like I'm making a bold claim. I want people to test it because that proves the claim. It's like if I said, and I always use this example, but I always say, if I made a vase that was indestructible, it was indestructible. A nuclear bomb wouldn't break it, right? I'm making that claim. I want people, perhaps not use the nuclear bombs, but I want people to come with
please don't.
But perhaps come with your hammers, come with your saws, come with your machine, come with whatever you got, and try to break my vase, because I'm saying it's indestructible. And I'm making a kind of similar challenge to people with this Nations of Sanity project. I'm saying, look, there's certain assertions here that are undeniable. And if you think I'm wrong, please come and tell me, because I don't see it, and I want people to kind of,
scrutinize it. You want some feedback. I think it's wonderful. Also, I like the discussion about how we went into that kind of like grey area before, and you explained it so well. If you skipped over that, please go back and have a listen. It was really enlightening.
Well, actually, what I might do quickly, because we'll probably wrap up, we've been talking for a bit, we'll probably wrap up this conversation in a minute, but what I will just...
It's all in the edit, Matt.
But what I'll do is I will just repeat that, because in a way, because I want to tell you specifically, I don't know if you know about the 3-part agreement. I don't know if you got to that when you were reading.
Yeah, I have, yeah.
Oh, you have? Okay. Well, just to anyone else who's listening, so they know what we're talking about. Because like this idea is to establish the non-aggression principle as the law through a peace agreement. And the idea, as I said, is, it has to be done through a peace agreement. That's another point I wanted to make, is that obviously the reason it's through a peace agreement is because it can't be done through a ruling authority, because that violates the principle, so it will have to be done as a peace agreement. But the other thing about it is, and this has actually come from talking to people like yourself and having this idea scrutinized, that help kind of get it more polished up, because it was originally the idea of saying, okay, well, let's make this a peace agreement. Let's just say, let's make the non-aggression principle the law, and that's that. And then I kind of realized, with the help of people like yourself kind of questioning me about the grey areas, I was like, okay, well, that's actually not good enough, because even if we had a world where we all agreed to establish the non-aggression principle as the law, our interpretations of what the non-aggression principle aren't exactly the same.
Yeah.
That's why we need the universal standard. So what I thought I'd do is like say your interpretation. I'm sorry, I'm using visual aids here, but this is my hand and this is my hand.
That's great. I've got hands as well, man.
Say your interpretation of the non-aggression principle is this hand, and mine is this hand, and they're both nearly the same, but there's a little bit of bleed over. You're a little bit here, and you're a little bit there. And what I'm saying is okay, for this universal agreement, we're going to lower the resolution a little bit. Not to the point that we lose it, obviously, it's still, but just to the point where we make it as objective as it possibly can be, where that black and white is truly on the black and white as much as we could possibly make it from a purely objective approach. And so the reason why I changed the peace agreement was it was originally just a one-part agreement, and now it's a three-part agreement. And the three parts is part one is the basic agreement to establish the non-aggression principle of the law. Part two is called lines in the sand, which is where we set the limits of tolerance over the differing interpretations to separate the black and white from the grey area, with the understanding that we don't enforce the grey area, we only enforce the black and white as this universal standard. And then part three is ratifying rightful ownership, because obviously it's all very well saying no one's allowed to steal from anybody, but if we don't agree who owns what, then that's a pretty meaningless thing. And just like everything else, property rights can be objectively defined from the very simple concept of self-ownership. And just to go through that very briefly, if you own you and you are responsible for yourself and your actions, then you own your actions. And again, that's right and responsibility. So if you commit a crime,
like that. That was very keen. That was very, very keen. I like that.
Yeah. So like
I do own a bunch of shit.
Well, yeah, and rightly so. I mean, this is the thing about property, because I get a bit annoyed with like a lot of people with a more commie persuasion who kind of have this blanket opposition to property where they don't distinguish between rightfully owned and ill-gotten property, you know, because it's this is important, because when we talk about ownership, we're making a moral claim. Because when I say that, if I say that that's your car and you own it, that's not the same as you being in possession of it. You might have stolen the car. It might not be your car, but you're in possession of it. So when I say you own it, then I'm saying, well, more than you're just in possession of it, I'm saying that's rightfully yours. Now, why is it rightfully yours? Well, it can only be rightfully yours two ways. Either you acquired it through voluntary trade, or you created it. Or there could be some kind of combination. And this is where property rights comes from self-ownership. Because we own ourselves, we also own what we create and have right over what we create. We're responsible for our actions in the sense that we're criminally responsible if we commit a crime, and we're obviously we own our actions in that sense.
Indeed.
But we also own our actions in the sense that if we build a house, assuming that we're doing so without stealing materials and we're not violating
anyone else's self-ownership.
Yeah. As you know, assuming all of those things are in place and all things are equal, I build a house. The only person who has rightful claim of ownership over that house is obviously me.
Yourself, yeah.
And that comes from the simple fact, again, that's not me making an arbitrary declaration that I should own a house because I built it. That's coming from the basic concept that I have right over me. And the only person that can claim right over what I created with my own hands and materials I've acquired and all the rest of it is me. And the only way that you could possibly own that house is if I voluntarily give the ownership over to you, whether you buy it off me or I give it to you because I'm kind or whatever.
Fair trade. Yeah, exactly. Fair and conscious trade between two people. Yeah.
Exactly, and all of it is just an exercise. And the reason why, I'm glad you agree. But the point is it's like it's not just because you agree because you've got property and that sounds good to you. But hopefully the reason you agree is because you can recognise that it comes back from that logic. Like I say, that 2 + 2 thing. If you own you, then obviously you own what you create. If you own you, obviously you own what another consenting adult has given to you voluntarily. That's all. If you own you, obviously you're not allowed to rape people.
What did we call this? I called it common sense, but we gave it another name.
Good sense.
Good sense. There we go. Yeah.
Yes, because it's certainly not common, unfortunately. But but maybe one day it will be. If we ever have a revolution.
You know, I can only hope. Final question.
Okay.
Yeah, because I know you probably it's coming up to 11 o'clock now. You're probably looking at tucking a kid into bed, or
no, he's with his mum tonight, so we're all right.
Oh, yeah, really? Okay. So final question. and this is probably quite interesting. I don't know or not, but I hope you find it interesting. Is revolution is defined as something very, very sudden, and looking back at revolutions in the past, they've been very sudden, and there's been huge upheaval, sometimes loss of life and things like that. There are very few bloodless revolutions in history, but do you see Nations of Sanity as more of an evolution or a revolution?
I would call it a revolution, but the reason why
what are the dangers there, though?
I can understand the trepidations over the word revolution. I mean, just to quickly why I would call it a revolution rather than evolution. I mean, this would distinguish what I'm doing from someone like Larkin Rose, who I mentioned earlier. And anyone who doesn't know who he is, check him out. He's a well-known anarchist who promotes voluntarism and the non-aggression principle, much as I am. But he is trying to just get people to evolve, just spread the word, tell people to ignore their government, and hopefully we'll all just get there. And as much as I applaud his work in regards to changing hearts and minds, I don't trust our evolution to just get there, because to be perfectly frank, we'd have got there already if we were just going to get there.
We weren't such a bunch of dumb shits, right?
Yeah, so I do feel like we need a kind of revolution, because unfortunately a large percentage of the population are sheep and will just be led which way is going. And it is up to the people who aren't sheep to try to say, okay, well, look, this is what we're not going to take and this is what we are going to take, and hope they can get the masses on their side, which isn't a guarantee. But the reason why, so that's why I call it a revolution, because I'm not saying, oh, let's all get there eventually. I'm saying, no, this needs to happen tomorrow. It needs to happen today. It should have happened 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, whatever. But at the very least, let's get it done as soon as possible, and let's change our society. I mean, this is the whole thing about saying I want to establish the non-aggression principles law, because I don't want to wait for nearly every human being on the planet to just start.
You'll be waiting forever, man.
Exactly. This is why I don't want to be disparaging about Larkin Rose's efforts, because he does a lot of good work to spread this principle, and it's important what he does. And I certainly look at my own work as being somewhat synergistic to his efforts with regards to pushing the same principle and the same ideals and all the rest of it. But for me, it's like I just don't think we're just going to evolve there, even with the work of people like him, because there's too many other people working in the opposite direction, forcing us into the opposite direction, using physical force. It's all very well us saying, oh, well, we'll try and change hearts and minds. The people with guns don't need. I mean, one thing that's often said to me that I think a lot of people miss the point. You know that phrase that you can fool some people sometimes, but you can't fool all the people all the time.
All the people all the time. Yeah.
There's a problem that people miss with that phrase. Is the people that rule us don't need to fool all the people all the time. They only need to fool some of the people some of the time. Yeah, because the
rest will follow along.
Exactly. And this is the problem. So what I'm saying is it is a revolution, but it's not going to be a bloody one or a violent one. It doesn't need to be. In fact, this is, for me, this is the way we have peace, because these are the only possible acceptable terms of peace that can be truly universal. You think about how, like I say, I want people to not like, people look at this and think, oh, like revolution, and they think of violence, but it's like, think about what this is actually a revolution of. This is a revolution of thought. Oh yeah, and also it's a revolution of saying, even when we enforce this, like let's say, for example, we had to there was some resistance against this, and it actually involved conflict. Because I'm not blind to those possibilities. What are we fighting exactly? Who are we fighting? People that oppose the non-aggression principle? That's not a grey area. That'll be the first time in history, probably since the Nazis, where we've had such a clear evil to fight against. People that are opposing the non-aggression principle, people that are opposing the idea that every individual has right over their own selves. That's something that this society likes to pretend is already what we're promoting. So for them to openly fight against it would be a hard sell,
But there's always going to be someone that prefers a fancy uniform. Yeah, unfortunately.
But they've got to go home to their wife and kids. They've got to go home to their communities. And like I say, at the moment, they're still carrying the facade that they're serving public, and there are still people that buy into propaganda and all the rest of it, although that facade is dropping in recent times with all the lockdown stuff, and a lot of people were turning on the police that previously supported them. Like I say, I've been consistent in my opposition. But my
if
point,
nothing else, like
yeah, exactly. But my point is they won't, when it gets to that stage, when we're saying, okay, well, because what we're trying to, the problem is when we're saying, okay, we're going to overthrow our governments by establishing the non-aggression principles of universal law. We're saying everyone has right over only themselves, and the universal terms of peace define this as law objectively. No one has, all your other laws that are done under the ruling authority of this government or that government, they're all invalid because none of you have the right to rule over us. We're all free people. It's kind of like what the abolition of slavery should have been if it was comprehensive, complete, and done through a peace agreement. Unfortunately, it wasn't comprehensive and complete because obviously they don't want to make everybody completely free. So they just kind of rebranded it a little bit. And also,
and of course, women didn't have the vote, and the Native American Indians didn't get the vote.
Exactly, but the thing is, the reason why all of these things continued is even when they abolished slavery, they still done it under their own authority. It's like, we rule you, but we're going to make slavery.
We're going to say this, and it sounds like a really good idea, and it's going to make us more popular. I mean, it's like Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. I don't know if you've read that book. It's fantastic.
No, but I'll check it out.
Yeah, please do. It's a bit heavy, but there's some excerpts that are in there that will really resound with you. And it's and they actually based the Constitution of the United States of America on it, but they kind of bastardized it. All right, okay. Now Thomas Paine was an English guy, and he had to flee England after writing The Rights of Man. Subtitle Reflections on the French Revolution. So he had to flee England, and he was tried and sentenced to death in absentia, by the British government. And I think it's really outrageous because all he's really talking about is a lot of the stuff that you're saying. It's a fantastic book. I mean, he says everyone's entitled to their own selfhood. Everyone should respect everyone else's selfhood. No person, and I say this very strongly, so it's not man or woman. It's non-gender specific. And this is a guy who wrote like 200-300 years ago. So your ideas have been kicking around for a long time, and it's just a case of let's get it integrated and how we can strategize to do that.
I mean, because that's the thing I like to. I mean, people have even put it to me. They're like, "Well, you didn't come up with these ideas," and I'm like, "No, I didn't," and I'm not, I'm not claiming to. Like I say, and this is
you are a vocal voice for them. You're the mouthpiece, man, and I respect you for that.
Well, I suppose the only thing that's different, like I say, like I say, the thing that separates me from Lark and Rose is I have this very specific idea of making the non-aggression principle the law and establishing it through a peace agreement, and a 3-part peace agreement that deals with 3 dimensions of the basic agreement, the lines in the sand, and the ratifying of rightful ownership. Like, that specific idea, I suppose, is obviously unique to the Nations of Sanity, but the larger idea is ages old and been promoted by people like Thomas Paine and others. And I'm not as probably well read as you, so you could probably do a better job of
teacher.
Oh, there you go. So you can probably do a better job of obviously talking about the people that have promoted these sort of ideas in the past and that. But again, that's kind of what frustrates me. It's not like I'm coming up with something that nobody's thought of or anything like that. It's not like the idea of self-ownership is foreign. I mean, it's almost like I'm just trying to it's almost like everybody's kind of got all of these pieces and no one's connected.
And no one's connecting the dots
to say, well, why don't we make this the law then? If this objectively, I mean, like I say, that's why I get kind of almost irate, because it's almost like, okay, you go up to any intellectual, go up to someone like, I mean, I've been good luck trying to get hold of someone like Jordan Peterson, but I'd love to speak to someone like him because I'd like to, but anyone who's got any morals, it's like, we understand why. We don't just understand that rape is wrong. or murder's wrong, or slavery's wrong. We understand why they're wrong, and they're all wrong for the same reason. So it's like, okay, again, it's just the 2 + 2 = 4. Everybody can do the maths. It's not hard maths. I'm not a genius for saying, look, 2 + 2 = 4, but no one's making that obvious. Then they could work it out. It's not even a thing to work out. It's just something to recognize as blatantly true. If we all own ourselves, then the non-aggression principle defines crime objectively. If the non-aggression principle defines crime objectively, then we should make it the law. And if we're going to make it the law, the only way you can do that without it contradicting itself is to do it through a peace agreement. You know, it's like these things are self-evident, and that's the thing that frustrates me currently with our society and with all the people that currently cohabit it, that, you know, we can, you know, that we can, like I say, there's greater minds than me that are just ignoring this. And even people that are talking about the general subject, I hear, you know, like, that's why I want to talk to someone like Jordan Peterson, because I'll hear him do an interview with someone where he'll be like, so how do we solve this problem of, like, you know, rights in society? And it's like, it's fucking obvious. But
people occupy a position, don't they? So they occupy this position, and it's like an ivory tower. It's indefatigable, and they cling to this belief without being flexible to really listen and try out something new. Because people are terrified of change. Any kind of change in their lives, they kind of go, oh my God, I can't do it. And this is very, very sad that people aren't taught how to properly think about things, critically analyze the information right in front of them. They'd rather be tacitly complicit and be spoon-fed, what you know, inverted comma facts, right, and you know, and gobble them down and then occupy that position, And, you know, it's something I teach to my kids. I say, look, just because someone else who's older than you, even me, tells you it's true, check your facts. Go off. Think about it for yourself. Do your research. Have an opinion. Please.
Exactly,
So, you know, I believe that any kind of revolution will be more evolution. And we might not see it in our lifetime, but, you know, we still remember Thomas Paine. Okay.
Yeah, I suppose the reason why I'm pushing for the revolution over the evolution is because that's the fundamental change I feel like we need to do. If we were able, as unrealistic as it may seem, if we were able to overthrow our governments and establish the non-aggression principle as the law, like, people fear revolution because they fear the upheaval. I mean, I like to try to paint a picture of how that just is not how it would go, because, like, if we establish the non-aggression principle as the law tomorrow, let's say we did it tomorrow, right? Everything carries on as usual. The only difference is, like, we don't have to start burning down all the government buildings. We're not going to start digging up the roads because we paid with them with stolen tax money. I mean, everything carries on, but now you're a self-owning individual, and that's universally recognized. So what was a government is now only able to continue as a voluntary collective, and it can still operate, providing infrastructure, services. It can still be democratically represented, but it has no ruling authority over anybody. All it is a group of people that have come together
who administrate basic public services.
Exactly. And all of a sudden, the corruption and the bureaucracy that we have in government, which is inevitable in a coercive system, because when you have people that rule over you against your will, that use money that's taken from you against your will, you're not going to get value for money. You're not going to get them doing what, you know, like the corruption we see in the police, the corruption we see in the politicians. It's all, I suppose that's what frustrates me. It's so inevitable in a coercive system. That's why we've got to change the system. That's why we need revolution over evolution, because we won't evolve to it all the time. We have this coercive system. That's why I want to flip that. And like I say, if the non-aggression principle was the law tomorrow, you carry on. you know, crimes are still crimes, but now you have the freedom. Now, for example, if you said to me, do you know what, I don't want to be part of this collective, this what was the government, even in a free society, I don't want to be part of it. Well, you don't have to be, and we have no control over you, and you don't have to flee the country, because that's often said to me. They go, oh, if you don't like it, go to another country. Yeah, but it's like, yeah, but that's not how consent. I mean, it worries me when people say that, because they often say it in response to people, like I'll say taxation's theft, and they'll say, well, how's it different from rent? And I'm like, well, because rent is a voluntary agreement by definition.
And taxes, we haven't agreed to be taxed up the arsehole.
Exactly. Tax is taken under the threat of force. There's literally a threat of force.
A threat of imprisonment as well.
Well, that's the force of, So what I'm saying is that's the definition of theft. So then they'll say to me, okay, well, you can go, but you're consenting by not leaving the country. And I'm like, that's not how consent works. You're not consenting because you've not fled the land of your birth. The government has no claim of ownership over this country. So I shouldn't have to flee. If I wanted to opt out of this quote unquote society, I should still be allowed to live here. If people want to shun me, that's fine, but they don't have right to use force against me. They don't have right to kick me out of the country or, and this is the thing about, like, as people talk to me about national borders, they would, and they say, well, does that mean all the national borders are going to evaporate? And I'm like, well, as something that you can enforce and prevent peaceful people from crossing, yes, they would, because the only borders you would have a right to enforce would be rightfully owned private property, because you have a right, right over that. But that doesn't mean...
hello dude, don't come into my front garden, I'm having a barbecue.
Exactly. But if you want to travel to Vietnam because you want to visit the mountains or whatever, or you want to, or someone wants to go to America because they want to visit the Grand Canyon, the American government shouldn't be able to stop them. Now, if they think that these people coming are like some kind of, invasive force or they're whatever, then
they're free to protect their citizens.
Exactly, yeah. But if they don't have any basis for that, and that would be like anything, again, because people say, well, where's the standard for this? Who decides and all the rest of it? It would all come back to the same, like it would all boil down the same as it would in a kind of person-to-person situation as it would on international levels. Like, it's like you say, okay, well, if say someone threatened to come and shoot you, and then someone came walking onto your property that looked like that person, and they had an overcoat and all the rest of it, and you went and you came out with your gun and said, look, show me your hands and show me your weapons, and I'm not letting you pass here until I know you're not the person coming to kill me and all the rest of it, and all the rest of it. That's not the same as you taking some kind of arbitrary authority by saying, that you're not allowed to pass here, don't care who you are, don't care how peaceful you are. You know what I mean? Those aren't the same situations, So, and sometimes people might step over the line of what they're allowed to do in like I say, in situations where they're being under threat.
People panic.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, we've still got to accept that we're human beings, we're flawed, we're not perfect, we live in an imperfect world, not everything's black and white. And all of those, like when people say that to me, those are all valid points, and I'm not arguing against them. But my point is not only does this work despite those realities, it's the best way of working despite those realities, because we're bringing everything down to its most objective possible level. We're not saying this is a crime because I think so or you think so. We're saying it's as a matter of basic 2 + 2 logic
equals 4.
And we're basically saying that's how everything operates. We operate on that. And when people say, well, should this be illegal and all that, it's not even a conversation. You don't get to decide what's illegal. I don't get to decide. You don't get to decide. What is illegal, what is a crime, is objectively defined on the reality that we all own ourselves. It's as simple as that. And even more complicated issues, we can simplify how we find the answer to them. Because when people say, oh, well, okay, well, how do we decide who owns something? People say, well, the Israel-Palestine conflict. They'll say, well, that's complicated. How are you going to solve that with your non-aggression principle? Well, actually, quite easily, funnily enough. Nice and simple. Israeli government or people or anyone else do not have a right to kick Palestinians out of their homes, and Palestinians don't have a right to just attack Israeli citizens. Simple as that. Neither have a right to attack each other. So there's obviously wrong on both sides. It's not an even fight because, obviously, I mean...
Yeah, but we can't sit in judgment of that. Yeah, but...
Well, I think we can to an extent.
AP, we can kind of say, okay, up to you.
Well, no. I wouldn't say that. I mean, let's put it this way. I would say that there's crimes have been committed on the, let's call it the Palestinian side, and crimes have been committed on the Israeli side. There's also there's innocent victims on both sides, but
goodness, yes,
it's also important not to pretend that this is some kind of even conflict. It is kind of the equivalent of, which is often the case, a 9-year-old Palestinian child chucking a rock at an Israeli tank is kind of similar to the grander scale of things. Like, you know, when I heard that Hamas had fired rockets into Israel the other day, I'm not saying this is true, and it sounds like I'm not saying putting this forward as a conspiracy theory, but the first thing that I thought was the people that done that aren't Palestinians. I'm not saying that's the case, but the reason why I thought that, I'm not saying it is the case, but just from a logic point of view, it made no logical sense for Hamas to fire rockets into Israel because they know none of them are going to hit, because Israel's defense system is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know, when I don't know if anyone's seen the videos of the rockets all just being blown up in midair long before they get like it basically, like, I don't think I can look at judgment on Israel's retaliation because,
you know, I have to know that Israel still have the Patriot missile system that the Americans supplied.
Yeah, I mean, this is the other.
That's going back 30 years, but you know, I still have that because I've got friends who I associated with when I was in the Middle East. I still stay in touch with them, and they're Israeli.
Yeah.
So you know,
but my point is technically Hamas did, you know, obviously attack Israel, and then that gives Israel the excuse to then obviously attack you know, Palestinian areas in their mind. The reason why I don't think they have that excuse, even if it genuinely was Palestinian people that had obviously fired the missiles into them and all the rest of it, which it may well have been. I'm not promoting a conspiracy theory that it wasn't. The reason why I said it that way, the reason why that thought came into my head.
Let's go and get our tinfoil hats.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is the reason why that thought crossed my mind was because it makes no sense from a Palestinian's perspective. If you're a Palestinian and you actually cared about that side of the cause, it would make no sense to attack Israel, because you know you can't do anything to them, and you know all you're doing though is giving them an excuse to blow the shit out of your place. And that's exactly what's happened. So I don't think Israel are justified in retaliation, even though I think the attack seemed to be the only possible motivation for the attack on Israel was to provoke that reaction. I still think that reaction isn't justified at all, because Israel were unharmed, and they were, like I say, it's the equivalent. It's the equivalent of like the tank having a kid throwing a rock at a tank, and then the tank turning around and blowing the shit out of the entire village, not just the kid that threw the rock, but the entire village. And this is my problem with a lot of what Israel does: is they killing innocent people. A lot of the aggressions they've caused with, you know, kicking Palestinians out of their homes and all the rest of it. But even if you said, okay, well, that doesn't excuse, you know, like, Gaza firing rockets into Israel and all the rest of it. Okay, it doesn't, and they shouldn't have. And like I say, there's no logical sense why they did.
Yeah, you know, shit happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is they couldn't have hoped to achieve anything other than a violent retaliation. That's the only thing. You know, either Israel was going to ignore them or they were going to fire back. So why they done it, I don't know. And that's what made me think, look, are the same people behind that the same people that are behind the response? You know what I mean? That's why, you know, without getting tinfoil hats on, it makes you wonder, because there's no logical sense behind the actions.
Yeah, we have to look at the why, don't we? We always have to dig down and have to think about why it's happening. Why would someone do that? Why would any rational person do that? But then again, let me play devil's advocate. I'm not necessarily taking this side, Matt.
No, yeah, cool.
But at the same time, I'm going to say people be crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, you got to admit that. Yeah, right. So sometimes people are just stupid and crazy. You know, I've seen a lot of stuff. You know, there was my next door neighbour in Saudi Arabia used to walk out into his back garden and fire an AK-47 into the air. Yeah, of an evening to show everyone he had an AK-47.
But you know what, though? I know what you're saying, and you're right, and I'm not going to disagree with that. But I do think that actually kind of, in a way, bolsters my case for the Nations of Sanity a little bit. Yeah. Because what I'm saying is this is because people are crazy, because people are so different. it's going to be very difficult to unite them, if not impossible. But this is the only theoretical way. And the reason why I have a little hope that it's actually possible is because if you talk to somebody on, let's say, like pro-Israel on this side, I know a lot of people understand that it's complicated and don't have a black and white view, but let's just say you were talking to someone that was fully like on the Israeli side of it. And then you're going to talk to somebody else who was fully on the other side of it, fully on the Palestinian side, and just viewed Israel as evil. And, you know, so you're talking to both sides, right? You will get a very similar argument from both sides as to why the other side is criminal. They will both list non-aggression principle violations that are being committed by the other side. And because of that, and this is why it's almost like, this is why I think that if this ever really got into the mainstream, it would become more powerful than it is just with someone like me just talking about it, because it becomes undeniable. Because then all of a sudden it's like, like say you're Israel and you're saying, oh, well, they're firing this at us and they're doing that and there's suicide bombers coming in here and all the rest of it. It's like, okay, well, why is that wrong? I know it's wrong, but you tell me why it's wrong. And then they'll say, well, because they don't have the right to do it. Yes, because these things are crimes, yes, because they're acts of aggression. And why are they crimes? Because they don't have a right over you and you don't have a right over them. The same, exactly the same morality that you want to protect you from them, attacking your citizens, is the same morality that should also protect them from you, that should stop you from kicking Palestine. I mean, the amount, like I say, I know it's not black and white, but some of the stuff that's happening to the Palestinians is absolutely despicable. And and by the same moral or not maybe the same moral compass, but at least the foundation of the morality that virtually everybody has, we can identify that as a crime. So it's not about taking sides over Israel and Palestine, because if someone showed me an example of some Palestinian terrorist who went into some street and just killed a bunch of innocent people and said to me, are you on the Palestinian side on that situation? I'm like, well, obviously not in that situation. I'm not, because I'm not on the Palestinian side or the Israeli side. I'm just saying what is and isn't a crime objectively. And a lot of the times the people committing the objective crime is the Israelis. But there are times when it's the Palestinians that are doing it. But my point is if a Palestinian stabs an Israeli in the street, the only person who's guilty of that crime is that individual Palestinian, not everybody in his village, not his family, not his friends, not even not people he works with,
not even the same nation.
Exactly.
Right.
We don't have collective guilt. Every white person in the world isn't responsible for slaving every black person. Every Arab in the world isn't responsible for the terrorism of another. I mean, it's like we're not responsible for what other people do just because they share our nationality or our race or even our neighborhood of where we live or our religion or any other kind of thing. And I suppose, and I know we're going to wrap it up. I suppose my final thought, if you like, is simply that we can still be different in all of these ways. We can still be atheist and religious or different religions. We can have we can be left wing, right wing. We can be conservative, liberal. We can be all of these different types of things, and we can be different in all of these ways. And we can still have those divisions and live in peace if we get the one dividing line right, the one dividing line that's worth fighting over, which is those terms of peace, which is I own you, I own you, I own me,
really,
you own you, and and same through
and you
for
own
everybody.
you.
And that's how it is. And once we're all on board on that, everything else can be negotiated peacefully. But if we're not on board with that, everything's fucked, excuse my language. So what I'm saying is the reason why I like point to Nations of Sanity is so much more important risk of sounding arrogant than a lot of other movements and causes, is those other movements and causes can exist within what the Nations of Sanity is proposing, and that's great. Like I'm not getting into the details of exactly how our economy should work or exactly how we should live. I'm just saying,
we'll get into that in later conversations, I'm sure.
For sure, but what I'm saying is, and I have ideas on that regard, but none of that I want to force on people. I want to live in a world where no matter what idea I've got, you don't have to go along with it if you don't want to, because you own you and I own me, and we all live in a society that understands that. And my point is if we don't have that, if any idea that falls outside of that paradigm is criminal by definition. And any idea that falls within that paradigm might not be a good idea, but we have no
It's
right
up
to
to
stop
the
it.
individual to accept that and take that on board.
Exactly. And with that, I will wrap up this conversation. And unless you have anything else you want to add or say.
Yeah, listen, I just wanted to say thank you very much for speaking to me this evening. It's been enlightening, interesting. You've challenged a lot of what my preconceptions. You've really explained stuff really well, and I hope the people listening or watching, got as much out of it as I did. Thank you very, very much, Matt.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and I hope people listening to got something out of it as well. I appreciate you taking the time to have the conversation with me. I really enjoyed it.
Man. Maybe we can explore some of the other aspects at a later date.
Certainly, yeah. I'm always happy to have more conversations like this. So, yeah, that invitation is open to you, and anybody else listening, it is also open to. So,
yeah,
I will say goodbye to everybody listening now, and say thank you again, Alek, for taking your time.
No problem.